All right, well, I'm Mackenzie Warren, news executive at Gannett, and I'm live on location here in Boston at the IRE conference. That's Investigative Reporters and Editors, and I'm here with one of the co-founders of IRE. Back in 1975,
correct.
Len Downie Jr. Helped found this organization. And Len, I think, is a name so well known in journalism, I don't really have to recite a whole lot of your resume, but just off the top, you oversaw 25 Pulitzer Prize winning efforts while executive editor at the Washington Post, and nobody has ever compiled a hardware case that big when it comes to Pulitzers. And among your many, many other awards, I know one that you're very proud of is having won the Ben Bradlee Editor of the Year Award. Ben Bradlee, a mentor and a colleague of yours,
correct,
going back many decades. Len, a phrase that you use frequently and have for many years is accountability journalism.
Right.
I'd like for you to describe what you mean by that, please.
Right. I began as an investigative reporter at a young age, at a time when the Post was expanding rapidly, and when investigative reporting was beginning to become back into vogue locally in the mid-1960s. And so that's been my passion in journalism ever since, in addition to everything else I've done. And over the years, I realized that this should not just be a narrow part of journalism, confined to investigative reporting teams and big, long projects. But in fact, all journalism ought to hold accountable those in society who have power and influence over everybody else. So that means accountability journalism is important in sports. How are sports teams owners behaving? How are the athletes behaving? It ought to be true in entertainment. It ought to be true, obviously, in politics, government, in covering the economy and corporate America. The Washington Post has changed 3 major charities in the United States through accountability journalism about them. So it ought to be ingrained in all journalism, and it can be done by all journalists. It's not some sort of specialized priesthood. It is, I think, basic to journalism.
And accountability about oneself as well.
Correct. About the media itself. Yes, that's correct.
So you've hired and nurtured many great reporters who have, highly decorated careers. But I know that in preparing for this interview, you've looked for people who are self-starters, and creativity is a factor that you're looking for. Say why that is.
Yes, I think there's a mistaken notion, even sometimes among young journalists, that editors are these really smart people who are going to tell them what to go out and cover. I know a lot of people who aren't in journalism think that. I think Katharine Graham used to tell us what to go out and cover. When in fact the best stories come from the bottom up. The best stories come from the reporters on their beats, in their general assignment work and so on. And so you want reporters who are going to be able to spot things that are newsworthy, that are important to report about, that are not obvious, that are not a press conference, not an event, not a town council meeting, although those are all news, but the other things that are important in society that come out of a very creative approach to what news is.
Traits that are characteristic to great reporters are probably also what make great editors, but you as an editor have been described as being decisive, firm in your conviction and confident in your judgment, and graceful under pressure. But you weren't necessarily born that way, were you?
No, I was a relatively introverted person, and investigative reporters, the narrow kind of investigative reporters, are used to working in the shadowy world where, we're in a lot of musty records, and most of our interviews are confrontations with people, and so that doesn't exactly lead itself to newsroom leadership. And back in the day when I first started becoming an editor, there wasn't a lot of training for newsroom leadership either, as there is now. So one learned by doing, and one learned by being mentored. You used that word earlier with Ben Bradlee. And there were a series of editors that I worked for at the Post who were mentors of mine, but who I also learned from by watching. They didn't always know how to tell me what they were doing, but I could see what they were doing, their mistakes as well as their triumphs. And I try to internalize that in my working with people. There's also a balance that you need to achieve between being decisive. The executive editor of a newspaper, the executive producer of a news show has to have the final say on things. You can't have a committee deciding what's going to go in tomorrow's newspaper in the end. But at the same time, it's very important to be collegial, to take all that creativity we just talked about and bring that into the decision-making process, not to shut your door and say that I don't want to hear from this really brilliant reporter who thinks I'm making a mistake about a decision about a story.
Now that's a little bit about who you are today, but I want to go back to the banks of the Cuyahoga River in Lake Erie when you were 11 years old back in Cleveland. You knew even then you wanted to be a journalist.
Well, two things happened when I was 11 years old. One was that Louis Seltzer, a man named Louis Seltzer, was the editor of the Cleveland Press at the time, a now defunct newspaper, Scripps Howard newspaper, and he was quite a figure around town, a celebrity in addition to being the editor. And he was speaking at a local public library, I think, in our neighborhood, and my dad, who would have been a newspaper man if it hadn't been for the Depression that prevented him from going to college, took me to that event, and I just fell in love with the notion of this guy and what it was he was doing. And at the same time, I was lucky enough at elementary school to have an English teacher who was enamored of journalism and started a little student newspaper. And by newspaper, I mean a mimeograph sheet that came out, or maybe 6 mimeograph sheets that came out 2 or 3 times a semester. And in the 5th grade, I was a reporter at it, and I fell in love with reporting. And in the 6th grade, I ran it, and I fell in love with being the boss.
I got it. So you were the executive editor of the Mimeograph Gazette.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And so that was true for you throughout your upbringing, where you were simultaneously a reporter, but also a mentor and a coach. And
yes. Well, in junior high and senior high and in college, I started out as a reporter and then became a section editor, usually the sports editor, because I enjoyed sports. And then usually ran the student newspaper. In junior high, I was the co-editor of our junior high paper with Donna Shalala, who's now the president of the University of Miami.
And a former Gannett board member.
Yes, that's right. So she went straight and went into public service, and I stayed in journalism.
Well, that's great. And then you wound up working as the sports editor at the Lantern, one of the great college papers in the United
Yes, I was
States.
fortunate enough to cover, you'll forgive me as a Northwestern graduate, 2 national championship teams. The Buckeyes were the national football champions.
Happy to help you make that happen.
Yeah.
We've made a lot of champions.
And I have to say, that's the most fun one has in journalism, is covering sports.
Absolutely.
To this day, I still miss that.
Sure. Well, so right out of Ohio State, you proved to be a prodigy as a reporter. You were a summer intern in 1964 at the Washington Post, and a year and a half later, you were writing a story that would ultimately be a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and would upend a corrupt, ineffective municipal judicial system in Washington, D.C. Tell a little bit about what it is that you saw and how the hell some kid got that story.
I've always said to new reporters, I say to my students today at the Arizona State University's Cronkite School, that at any good news organization, any individual reporter can make a difference. Editors are crazy to turn down good stories. They don't turn down good stories. So in this case, as it happened, Ben Bradley had covered that court as a young reporter years earlier, and the then city editor of the paper had covered that court a few years earlier. And I was doing my weekend duty as a young, literally, first months at the paper, covering arraignments on Saturday in that court. And I wrote some stories about some crazy things I saw going on that caught their attention. And they thought, let's just send you down there, forget the beat reporter, ignore what he's doing, and we know that's a crazy place. Just see what we might be able to do to describe that place to our readers. And that led to a year-long investigation of the court that produced a series of articles that came out at just the right time because the Johnson administration was oriented toward court reforms, and they abolished the court.
And I don't think Washington, D.C. had home rule at the time. So
no, it's federally operated, that's right.
So it was a good laboratory for retrofitting a broken system.
Exactly.
I think a lot of courts around the country have gotten better because of that story, not just the one in Washington, D.C. Well, so then you moved on. 1968 came around, one of the most pivotal years in American history, and you were covering the race riots. And in fact, contributed to some book work, and you got better and better as a reporter. But still, you're this pretty young person. And sooner or later, we get around to a break-in at the Watergate Hotel. And if my watch is correct, that's almost 40 years to the day today.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Take us back to the heat. We don't have to recount all the details of the story because everyone knows that, but when you got into reporting that story, and you were one of the primary editors involved in that, you took a lot of heat from the Nixon administration to back off, and you were alone out there for a long time on that story.
Yes, Carl and Bob and the really great city editor who directly supervised them, Barry Sussman, and Ben Bradley, obviously at the top, and the then managing editor, Howard Simons, really believed in this story. We didn't know where it was going to go, but they really believed in this story. And the pressure was immense, the fear of making a mistake. Because back at that time, there was no internet, no cable television, and there had not really been much in the way of investigative reporting of the federal government. And so even the best political minds in the country, David Broder told me this later, just couldn't believe that this could possibly be true, that a White House could really be engaged in this.
Mm-hmm.
And so they, by
we
and
had
large,
such trust in our institutions then.
So they either ignored it or they thought it was wrong.
Yeah.
And so we were left alone for the longest time. It was one of the few times in my career when I welcomed competition,
mm-hmm.
when the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and most importantly, Walter Cronkite got onto the story.
And we're going to return to Walter Cronkite here at the end of this conversation. But I think you might have taken a little heat from Katharine Graham at some point, didn't you?
Well, no, we didn't really take heat from her. She was protective of the story, and I didn't deal with her directly at that time. Ben did. And that's another important function of an executive editor. As Ben says, choose your right owner, mm-hmm. which she was.
Well, you made a good choice.
And then you be the one that deals with the owner and the publisher, and you insulate the newsroom from the pressures that unfortunately owners and publishers feel in situations like that. And he did a good job of that. So what went on between the two of them, we didn't really know that much about. Mm-hmm. But she basically was supportive, even though she couldn't understand why we were alone in the story and why.
But it's such a great story. Where's everybody else?
Exactly. And all of her business friends were telling her she was crazy.
Of course. And
the Post had just gone public. So literally, that financial health of the newspaper was at stake.
Yeah. Well, and as long as we're talking about Pulitzer winners, of course, Katharine Graham posthumously won for her autobiography.
Not posthumously. She was still alive then. Yes.
Well, only had a few years left then.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yes. Because we have our Pulitzer ceremonies in our newsroom around the news desk.
And so she got to be a part of that.
And she got to be part of that. And she just could not believe that she had written something that would win a Pulitzer Prize. And Meg Greenfield, who was then the editorial page editor, and I and Kay were standing at the news desk watching the prizes be listed on our computer screens. And when it came to her award, before we were able to announce it to the newsroom, Meg turned to her and said, "Do you believe it now? It's there in black and white."
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah,
That's
she was
great.
very modest.
That's great. Well, a week ago today, in the Washington Post, you wrote a column in which you expressed some concerns about the state of investigative journalism in America. And that, of course, is well-timed to the 40th anniversary of Watergate, the gold standard of investigative journalism, and also why we're here at IRE today. So could you explain to people watching here why you feel the way you do about the state of investigative journalism?
It's both good news and bad news. Watergate really institutionalized, the legacy of Watergate over a period of years really institutionalized investigative reporting, accountability journalism, if you will, in so many newsrooms across the country as being an essential part of what newsrooms do, whether it's investigative reporting teams or accountability journalism done by beat reporters. Mm-hmm. Since then, there's been this enormous economic change in American journalism because of the digitalization of everything. Mm-hmm. It has reduced the revenues of newsrooms across the country. As a result, they have less resources for all kinds of journalism, including investigative reporting. Many newsrooms still keep investigative reporting as their top priority. I just heard today that Gannett is doing that in its newsrooms across the country, and nevertheless, it can't be as much as it was before because there simply aren't the resources for it. That's one concern. The second concern is that a lot of new nonprofit investigative reporting organizations have been started by investigative reporters who've left other news organizations. And these are very promising because they do really interesting and exciting work. And increasingly, they're collaborating with commercial news organizations, supplying them some of the investigative reporting they can no longer do themselves. And that's good news. Yeah. The question there, though, is they are still financially very fragile.
How sustainable is
this?
Right.
There's no tradition yet in America of treating journalism as a charity. Right. The way local museums are, the ballet is, the libraries are, some kinds of schools are. So foundations have supplied some of this money, donors have supplied some of this money, but we can't yet see how it's going to become institutionalized over the next, say, even 5 to 10 years, and that's my worry.
Sure, that's a clear and present issue. Well, 10 years ago, you wrote a book called The News About the News.
Yes.
And I believe the subtitle was American Journalism in Peril.
Right.
And I just wonder, after you've had a chance to analyze what you wrote 10 years ago in today's context, where you think overall, not just investigative journalism is, but were you right 10 years ago? Were you more right than you wished you were? Have things changed from your view 10 years ago?
No, that was that book was a snapshot in time and an evolution that has picked up a lot of speed since then. We were, my co-author and I, Bob Kaiser, my co-author, and I, did not really understand the internet revolution yet then, just how much it was going to change things so rapidly.
Well, who did?
Yeah, well, we certainly did not. So that was something was sort of, the internet was in the book, but not the kind of change it really has affected. Since then, with a professor at Columbia named Michael Schudson, I've written something called The Reconstruction of American Journalism.
Yes.
A report that sort of brings us up to date from the news about
Yes.
the news.
Yes.
And the conclusions are a massive reconstruction's going on. You can't hold back the sea. No newspaper newsroom that is really going to survive is a newspaper newsroom anymore. It's a multimedia, multi-platform news organization. And everybody must change to accommodate that. We must interact with the public in ways that we didn't do before. We no longer can sit on a mountain and decide this is going to be news and you're going to receive it. We're going to receive news back from you now too. All kinds of things that are changing. A lot of it's very good. I think a lot of the best journalism now is better than ever. I think we said exactly that in the report. Because the internet provides resources for investigations and research that we never had before. It provides for interaction with our audience that's beneficial to journalism in ways that was not the case before. And yet at the same time, it is held open to question what the future economic models are going to be for journalism. And we still don't know the answer to that question.
Well, who the future practitioners of journalism are is one of your new interests.
Yes.
And you mentioned Walter Cronkite earlier. You're the Weil family professor at Arizona State University at the Walter Cronkite School of Communication and Journalism. I want to know, in this new project in your life, how you're harnessing the power of the next generation of journalists and how you're trying to shape and mold them and what you see from them.
What I see from them is very exciting. They've really opened my eyes to the best aspects of the future. They are all, I'm dealing with graduate students. These are the best of the students there. They are all multimedia skilled, completely. They can cut tape as easily as they can report and write beautifully. And that is essential to the future of news organizations. So while this has been a very difficult time for mid-career people who are not acquiring these skills, it is a great time of opportunity for these young people. They do not see a dying business out there. They see excitement. They see opportunities to do things that we couldn't dream of doing. In fact, they are doing things that I don't even understand what they're doing all the time. So my job is to help them with the traditional skills that they still need to have in terms of investigating and writing and shaping stories and so on. But they are supplying the multimedia ideas. We have a project going on right now. It's a multi-university project called News 21.
Northwestern's a part of that.
Yes, that's right. That is doing a project on voter rights during this election year. And the students came to me and said, we ought to be tweeting and we ought to have a blog. And I thought, oh my God, in the middle of an investigative project, is that a good idea? Are we going to give away the stories? Are we going to, is it going to siphon off attention from what we ought to be doing? Well, we do have a blog and they are tweeting and it's great. Yeah. Because they are able, it helps shape their project. It helps them get deeper into the subject to be engaged this way with their audience.
Sounds a lot like something you said a few minutes ago, where you got to have somebody in charge and making decisions at the end of the day, but that person's door can't be shut and their mind can't be closed to some new great ideas. Well, we only have a minute or two left, but I'd like to know if there's anybody, some folks have joined us here and in the audience, and if there's any question or remark that you'd like to make to Len before we let him get on his way.
Now, I'm hearing what you said about, you hear a lot of people telling you as a young journalist that this business is dying. Yeah. And just hearing what you said about, I don't see death in my business right now. I see excitement, and I can put my good tweeting skills to use now, and knowing that there are people out there who appreciate the fact that the young journalists are coming up and we can cut video and build a website for you and put your story on an iPhone and on an iPad. Knowing that there are people out there who have seen this business grow and just watched this business change and have been successful in this business, knowing that there are people out there who appreciate that is just amazing. So I really thank you for coming out here.
Well, good. Yeah, it's a transforming business. And that doesn't mean that there aren't risks. There obviously are risks for news organizations. Some are going to survive and some are going to transform and some are going to die. But it also is a risk for people coming into journalism. So there's this wonderful opportunity for young people like yourself. And yet at the same time, you're going to have to be good at what you do. to ride this wave of transformation. And I'm very excited about that.
That's good. One more, Christopher.
Christopher Kirkpatrick. I'm the business editor at the Detroit Free Press.
Uh-huh.
Two questions. One is, what advice do you have for the mid-career journalists you're referring to, which I fit into that category? And to what extent do you think the switch over to digital is either taking away from or adding to the depth of stories or whatever we call them now?
Right. The answer to your last question is both, and it depends on the news organization and how they want to use digital. It adds a lot. My best example to answer both your questions is Dan Baltz, the lead political reporter of the Washington Post, who is, Dan will excuse me, beyond mid-career. He's getting into later career. And he has completely adapted multimedia, completely. And he finds that it adds depth to his reporting because there's a constant interactivity going on during the day. If he posts something early in the day, he gets reaction during the day that makes the story for the newspaper the next day that much better. This whole interactivity is a great benefit to his reporting. So he's not in this relatively narrow world of politicians and political consultants. He's got all these other people out there who are constantly feeding him information. And even though it means that he works a lot harder, he always worked hard, but it means he works really hard to be able to do all these things at the same time. So it really requires a lot of energy. I do tell young people, don't get into this if you want to work 9 to 5. It never was 9 to 5. Now it really ain't 9 to 5 because of all the things you have to do at the same time. News organizations, though, that use this as an excuse to only cut costs and to only try to build a relatively shallow audience through relatively shallow reporting, then that can take away from the depth of reporting, but it doesn't have to. For instance, there's a lot of research now that shows that people read long things in the internet. It was a canard that people wouldn't read long things in the internet. They do. And it all depends on how you display it. I mean, if you make it hard to read something long on the internet, they won't read it. But longer things are readable on the internet. There's still a lot of news organizations, even though they have less money for less newsprint and therefore have a smaller news hole than they had before, will still devote part of that news hole. The Arizona Republic's a good example. Part of that news hole to long stories when the story justifies it. So it could cut both ways.
Really good. Thank you, Christopher. Well, Len, we only have time for one last thing that I wanted to ask you about, and it has to do with public service. Among the 25 Pulitzer Prizes that the Washington Post won under your leadership, 3 of those were the gold medal for public service. I know you're very proud of those, and I'd like to hear from you about how you view the connection between journalism and public service.
For me, journalism has always been public service. I always regarded it, I always call it a calling. I mean, it is the classic public service. It gives people the information that they need to live their lives, to be good citizens, to right wrongs, to hold people accountable, and all of that is a public service. Now, obviously, as Katharine Graham used to always say, you have to make money to pay for the public service, and so for commercial news organizations, there has to be a combination of being able to achieve a solid business that can perform a public service.
That's great. Well, look, I'd like to thank you for taking the time here and congratulate you on so many great works and so many things revealed, shining the light in dark places. You're a hero of mine and somebody that I think we all look up to. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us today, Len Downie.
Thank you very much. You're very kind. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, thanks.
That was great. Thanks
Good.
a bunch.